All right, welcome everyone. It is really a pleasure to be back with all of you and continuing our Berkeley Law COVID-19 conversation series. I'm Amanda Tyler. I'm the Shannon Cecil Turner Professor of Law at UC Berkeley School of Law, and I have the very special privilege today of welcoming two distinguished guests with us, Benjamin Wittes and Susan Hennessey, who are the authors of this spectacular book, Unmaking the Presidency, Donald Trump's War on the World's Most Powerful Office. We're going to be talking about their book and also current events today. First, a few words about our guests. Benjamin Wittes is the editor-in-chief of Lawfare, which he also co-founded, and which I will say to my students, if you're not reading it, you should be. He is a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, a former writer with the Washington Post, and the author of many books, including books on national security and the war on terrorism, the Independent Counsel, and the Judicial Confirmation Proceedings. Susan Hennessey is the executive editor of Lawfare and general counsel of the Lawfare Institute. She is a Brookings Fellow in National Security Law as well. Prior to joining Brookings, she was an attorney in the Office of General Counsel at the National Security Agency, and she is a graduate of Harvard Law School. Now, Ben and Susan, let's talk about this book. The book is enormously impressive and important. It is a book that covers the range of ripped from the headlines events in a very academic way. You wrote it in the midst of Trump's presidency, not waiting to see how the story is going to conclude. And indeed, within months of your book coming out, we've had both impeachment proceedings as well as the COVID-19 pandemic, which I have no doubt would have led to additional chapters in your book had you written it later. Why did you write the book to begin with? And why did you write it in the midst of his tenure as president, as opposed to waiting and evaluating the entire story at its conclusion?
So I will start this. Look, I think the short answer is this book is really born out of our attempts to understand what is happening and the nature of the American presidency and the ways in which the American executive was holding up under pressure, not holding up some of sort of the structural defenses we thought would function, not working in the way we thought that they were going to, and a whole new set of constraints functioning that we hadn't really thought about. And so really sort of trying to take this presidency and this proposition for a presidency really seriously and rigorously. People talk a lot about this disruption of norms that were happening, but where did they come from? Are they all good ideas, right? Should we carry them sort of moving forward? And I think in the process of writing the book, which really we sort of began even before Trump won, sort of the initial sort of impetus of the book is actually a series of posts that Ben wrote back during the 2016 election about sort of a Trump-like president, or if Trump were to win, and the Department of Justice, and sort of identifying the soft spots of the federal government. So it really was a long process. And one thing that sort of we distilled down in our thinking is this notion of there being this idea of the traditional presidency, this expectation and norm of how presidents are supposed to wield power and interact with the powers of their office, that's really, really important. And ultimately, we're quite explicit is a traditional, that the traditional presidency requires a defense. And so if we were to wait, even though it would be sort of academically satisfying to wait and be able to tell the whole story, if you want to make an argument that's a little bit more proactive and ultimately an argument that's aimed at voters in the 2020 election, the moment in which we have to decide whether or not we want to defend our traditional understanding of this institution, or instead if we're comfortable and prepared for it to be changed really forever.
I'll just add to that, that nothing that has happened either in the impeachment or in the COVID-19 crisis has, in my judgment anyway, undermined a syllable of the book. And in fact, it's They've provided innumerable examples of large themes that we wrote chapters about. But, you know, we had a little bit of time to write a short a kind of epilogue postscript about the impeachment. We did not have, there was no time to write anything about COVID-19. But, you know, the features of the Trump presidency that we wrote about in the book are very much the features on display when he stands up there and gives these, you know, 2-hour briefings that are about many things, but they are not about the traditional management of the executive branch. They're not about the sort of vertically integrated performance of the executive branch. They're primarily expressive for his own purposes. They're endlessly self-involved, and they are, you know, shockingly without reference to his oath of office. And so I do think that there's we lost relatively little except a lot of examples in writing it when we did. I think the features of the Trump presidency that will be the ones that the presidency is grappling with for many years to come were very much on display by the time we published the book. And I haven't noticed major other ones, to be honest, in the months since.
Yeah, so you premise the book by asking the question whether Trump's tenure, how that would go, and specifically whether taking the office would change him or whether he would change the office. And what you've done is really dissect, as you mentioned, how he's changed the office over the course of his tenure. And you highlight a range of different ways in which he's done this. You open and you close the book making reference to the oath, which then you just discussed, at least briefly. Can you talk a little bit about why the oath is so important to the story that you tell and specifically to the presidency?
Yeah, so the oath is one of the least studied provisions of the Constitution by constitutional scholars. It does not have a significant scholarly literature. It doesn't show up in a lot of case law because it's kind of non-operational as what it actually does other than its ceremonial qualities. And yet the founders took it very seriously to the extent that they actually wrote the script for it into the Constitution. They spent time talking about it at the convention. It's literally the only place in the Constitution where the document uses quotation marks, right? So they felt strongly enough about it to, write a little script. And the reason is that it's actually the only thing that forces or requires people to do a good job, or at least try to. There's lots of, you can't actually require that the president be a good commander-in-chief. You can't require that he be a decent person. You can't require that he do his best on behalf of the country, and that when he gives information to Congress about the State of the Union, it's true information, right? All you can do is have a take care clause that says he's gotta, take some care. And you can have an oath where he, in front of everybody, formally promises to do his best. And because we assume that of people, we don't really notice often the extent to which the Constitution actually depends on a certain degree of civic virtue, actually depends on when people take that oath, they kind of mean it. It moves them in some sense. And I think one of the things that's very striking about Trump is that he so evidently doesn't mean it. He so evidently doesn't take any of it seriously that you strip away the nature of his presidency, strips away the idea that there is civic virtue underlying any of this. And it becomes a very pointed reminder of the degree to which, yes, we rely on structural separation of powers. Yes, we rely on judicial review and people asserting their rights and litigating. Yes, we rely on Congress passing laws. But ultimately, at the end of the day, a lot of the system rests on people actually being, more of the system is based on civic virtue than we sometimes acknowledge.
Yeah, and just to add to that briefly, that the oath of office presents some sort of justiciable legal question, right? You could sue the president for not really meaning his oath. And we say sort of, we aren't attempting to convince the reader that President Trump doesn't mean his oath, and as actually a human being that sort of has shown himself to be incapable, really, of solemnly swearing an oath. Like, if you aren't with us on page 1, we don't expect to sort of change your mind by the time you get to the end of the book. But the oath is a really, really useful way to talk about something that all prior American presidents have shared. And that's an understanding and conception of the purpose of the American presidency. And that's different from saying all prior American presidents were good people or people who felt this deep reserve of civic virtue. But what they understood was, at an absolute minimum, the need to present this as sort of as their belief. And, in the bare minimum of cases, if we think about people like Richard Nixon, the decency to fake it, actually. And the decency to fake it, to be pretending to discharge the duties of your office, to wield the powers for particular purposes. And that purpose really being the public good and your genuine belief and understanding of what the public good is. That actually is a constraint. It requires presidents to behave in certain ways. And it actually turns out to be really important. And I think Donald Trump and his presidency have shown us how important it is, because it's shown us the extent to which he really is meaningfully unconstrained, and the willingness to not share this sort of pre-political commitment, sort of speaking in presidential tones and talking as if he's speaking to a constituency that is in fact the entire population of the United States, instead of just those individuals who voted for him. That actually he's able to do things and to get away with things and to not be held politically accountable in particular ways. And that's, we can condemn it, as not being sort of in keeping of the spirit of the Constitution. But if you really want to think sort of structurally and holistically about this office and about the changes and proposed revisions that it's going through, you need a way to pinpoint the absence and sort of the revolution of this presidency and this proposition. And it really is the notion that the purpose of the American presidency is to serve the personalized individual interests of the president primarily, and sort of the interests of the public only as a secondary matter. And that actually has really, really radical consequences and real consequences in how the judiciary responds to the executive branch, how the members of the executive branch respond to the president, what Congress does. There really are genuine and immediate consequences to this thing that seems sort of wishy-washy, this, we all had this feeling in our guts whenever we watched the president swear this oath that this guy didn't really mean it.
Yeah, one of the things that I loved about your book is how you weave current events in with history. And you talk about so many of Trump's predecessors in office. And you tell a story when you're talking about the presidential oath of George Washington's second inaugural, and how quite very seriously he took the oath, and how on various occasions he said, if to the American people, if you don't think that I'm fulfilling my oath properly, that's a problem. That's really significant. You also talk about how the oath featured in the travel ban litigation, and how the Department of Justice put emphasis on Donald Trump before the oath and Donald Trump after the oath. Can you say a few words about that?
Yeah, so I'll take this. So this is just sort of a striking thing, and it happened sort of in early March. I think I'm getting the timeline right, of 2017. So early, sort of in the Trump administration, and their early experiences with the court. And that's the DOJ makes this argument. They're litigating over the travel ban, and at issue is, of course, the candidate Trump's statements about needing a Muslim ban and calling it a Muslim ban and a total and complete shutdown of all Muslims entering the country until we figure out what's going on, and wanting to litigants wanting to say, hey, look, this travel ban is really about religious animus. He said it. The court should look at these statements, and DOJ quite reasonably coming in and saying, look, you can't hold the president responsible for what he said before he was president. The oath is this transformative moment. It's the moment in which he's changed from being just any old politician who says all kinds of things and he's doing it to win and he's doing it because he doesn't have information, to instead being the embodiment of the executive branch of the United States government and being this completely different person. And so they talk about the oath as having this transformative quality, and DOJ is on a reasonably sort of solid ground here. It's a common sense argument, and if George W. Bush or Barack Obama or Bill Clinton had to respond to and account for every statement they'd made prior to becoming president, it would be impossible, right, for DOJ to then adopt all of those statements. What's so remarkable about it, though, is that DOJ had to say it in the first place. They had to tell the court, look, remember, this guy is president and he did swear this oath and it's different now. And the mere fact that DOJ felt compelled to in briefs, something it hadn't done for us to the extent that our research was looking for it. It's an acknowledgement that the courts might be suspicious, that the courts might forget or be inclined to treat this person differently, and felt the need to sort of remind the judiciary of that. And I think that's a little bit of an example of the way the oath sort of is invisibly embeds sort of throughout the structural separation of powers. It's a real argument at the time. The problem is it's not sustainable because, of course, then President Trump makes those same statements over and over again as president. And so we see the Department of Justice having to sort of bob and weave, having first taken this very sort of clear line of, well, that's before and this is now, and everything he says now really matters. Now we have, throughout the travel ban litigation, and a number of other sort of lines of cases, DOJ actually arguing, the president says all kinds of things. The president tweets stuff, that doesn't mean anything. That's not speaking for the executive branch. The president made that comment, but he didn't know what he was talking about. It wasn't informed by the actual facts on the ground. And so we've actually seen the Department of Justice having to adopt this sort of, constantly defensive shifting position, in part because this position that they adopted at the very beginning, I think an eminently reasonable one, wasn't sustainable over time, because the president wasn't actually transformed by his oath of office and wasn't interested even in pretending to be, and that has actually legally operative consequences.
Yeah, picking up with the travel ban example, you talk about how the decision-making process or processes in the executive branch have changed in this administration, and you use the travel ban example again there to sort of catalog the many ways that the processes have changed. You also have a line in the book that reads, if the goal is a presidency that can successfully do things, there is little logic to what Trump is doing here. Beyond being just simply great writing, that's a pretty powerful point. There's little logic to what he's doing here. Can you say a few words about how he's sort of functioning differently from past administrations in terms of how he makes decisions? And maybe even if you want to connect that to the current events that we're living through right now, including the pandemic.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting question, and it requires that you go back to period of the presidency before all this executive branch process stuff developed, which is really mostly, a creature of the early 20th century. But, in the beginning, the executive branch really was personal. I think when Jefferson became Secretary of State, as part of the big, when Madison became Secretary of State, Jefferson became president, the big, revolutionary act that they engaged in to save the taxpayer money, right? Small government, they reduced the size of the State Department from 7 clerks to 6. The presidency was John Adams sitting at home writing letters about, and Jefferson giving orders about where, a lighthouse should be or where a river crossing should be. It was a really personal office. And that did not survive the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, where you had this expansive growth of government such that the president, couldn't do everything by himself. And so you have the development of these agencies. Now, once you have the executive branch, which is supposed to be, a guy, right, or a woman, it's a person who's actually now supervising huge numbers of other people. The question is, what happens when those people don't agree or don't even know what the other ones are doing? Right? So when Jefferson and Hamilton disagreed, they had fights, they had arguments, and they would go to George Washington, and George Washington would tend to agree with Hamilton. And, that's why we have a musical about Hamilton and not about Jefferson. And when each of those becomes a giant building full of people, you need some processes to settle disagreements so that only the things that the president actually needs to decide get elevated to the presidential level. So executive branch process develops not because it's legally required, not because it's the natural order of things. It develops because the presidency works better if with it than without it. If you have experts who are empowered to do the things within their jurisdiction, unless there's some reason why it needs to be elevated up, you get a lot more done and you get it done more efficiently, and you save the president's time for the things that the president really needs to focus on. And all of that is a complete nonpartisan, no president has ever really disagreed with that in the 20th century until Donald Trump. And Donald Trump profoundly disagrees with it to the extent that he thinks about it at all. He wants to just announce things. He doesn't like process because it slows him down. And he doesn't really care about getting the right answer. And he also doesn't know anything, which means that, well, that's a really interesting combination: contempt for process, aggressive ignorance, and preferring to shoot from the hip. And you end up with some pretty radical stuff, like the president declaring that an unapproved drug, or approved for malaria but not tested for for COVID-19, is going to sort of save us from the COVID-19 crisis, and announcing that he feels good about it, right? That is a perfect example of this. He likes to shoot from the hip. He trusts his instincts. He doesn't believe in process. And so he does all kinds of things. And that has been, evident since really the day of his assumption of the presidency. The National Park Service tweeted some pictures that he found offensive because they showed Obama's crowd sizes at his inauguration to be larger than Trump's. And so he, declared that the Interior Department wasn't allowed to tweet anymore, right? These are things that normal presidents don't do. And as we wrote in the book, in the passage that you quote, it's if you're organizing the presidency in order effectively to do things, there is nothing to be said for this mode of doing business. But the point is that Trump isn't organizing the presidency in order to maximally efficiently do things. He's organized the presidency, to the extent that it's organized at all, as a vehicle and a platform for personal self-expression. And again, the COVID-19 briefings are a great example of that. He is up there for 2 hours a day expressing himself. And that is his vision of what the presidency is. And the process and the right answer and the organization of the executive branch to produce good factual bases for presidents to make decisions, and also to relieve him of those decisions that he's actually wholly unqualified to make, like what drugs people should be taking if they're infected with COVID-19, to have processes to answer those questions so that the president actually doesn't have to have an opinion other than we have an FDA approval process that relies on the best science, and I have confidence in my FDA administrator, right? That's what a normal president says in those situations. To relieve him of that, all of that be damned, because his goal is to use the presidency as a platform for himself.
And I think this is an area in which, Donald Trump puts pressure on notions that we should find uncomfortable and that have frustrated lots of prior presidents. So sort of this notion of this sprawling bureaucracy and the imposition of these layers of process that has been profoundly frustrating to Donald Trump. All presidents have sort of disliked and chafed against process. So, we think about Barack Obama signing the order to close Guantanamo Bay on his first day of office, and then finding out, actually, that's a little bit harder, and lo and behold, it's still open 8 years later, whenever he leaves office. Every administration, there are dozens of examples. And for some of sort of the bureaucracy and process hemming presidents in. Whenever there are presidents that are pursuing policy goals that we happen to share, we think of process and bureaucracy that works against that or slows that down or frustrates that as a bad thing and a negative thing and something we want this agile and muscular executive and president to be able to cut through. And instead, whenever it's a president who's pursuing policy goals and objectives that we don't like, we think about sort of the salvation of process and sort of bureaucracy coming in and sort of cooler heads prevailing and the imposition of expertise and accountability. And we think of that as sort of a comforting thing. And what Donald Trump has come in and done is shown that process is ultimately voluntary for a lot of stuff, that the president can just ignore it entirely and circumvent it. It doesn't have to be constrained by it at all. But it does, I think, really require us to ask uncomfortable questions about what are the decisions that we want to be made by elected officials in a manner that maximizes democratic accountability. What are decisions that we want to be made by career civil servants? And what are the trade-offs? Because this sort of the stability that comes with having a civil service that makes particular decisions. There's lots of benefits to that. Democratic accountability and political responsiveness is not one of them. And a huge challenge of the way we've structured our separation of powers and the executive branch particularly is really sort of fine-tuning who should be making what decisions and when. And so it is important that we think about these things really seriously in moments of intense pressure, which we're under right now, like the Trump presidency, and I think use them as opportunities to kind of reconsider some first principles and not just say, hey, I want the United States to remain in particular trade deals, and I don't want this impulsive lunatic to be, withdrawing us from NAFTA. And therefore, I think it's awesome that the president's staff is stealing letters off his desk so that he can't sign it. How do we reconcile that with, I want a president who makes particular decisions because I can then hold that person accountable. I can vote for someone else. I can require Congress to put particular pressures and mechanisms brought to bear on it. And so, those are really difficult questions. And I do think, getting past sort of our initial policy preferences to really think structurally about what's happening and how some of the breakdowns, and even breakdowns that we might consider successes in the era of the Trump presidency, whether or not those are sustainable, whether or not those are constitutionally faithful, and really how should we think about these questions moving forward in a world in which the reality is the executive branch is not one person, but these massive sprawling bureaucracies that really have to do things. I think you're muted.
Sorry, on that note, thank you, Susan. Trying to eliminate background noise that might come in. On that note, you talk about the sprawling executive branch, and a big issue that we study in constitutional law and law schools is this idea, this theory of the unitary executive. And you discuss in the book how Trump really isn't mastering this idea and this theory. Can you say a few words about that?
Yeah, sure. So, there's a sense in which, we've come to use the term unitary executive as as an ideological position. And so we associate it with, Dick Cheney and John Yoo and and Bill Barr, these kind of hardline conservative executive power theorists. And that is not the sense in which we are using the term unitary executive. We're using it in the much more pedestrian sense that there's only one president, right? And the president has the power to appoint all non-civil service, non-uniformed service people above a certain level in the federal government. And so everybody in the federal government, in one way or another, ultimately reports to the president. And then that's the only sense in which, so what I'm about to say is not an attempt to engage the debate about how much executive power there should be. But look, one consequence of that sense of the unitary executive is that you should be able to instill in your staff a certain amount of loyalty. I don't mean Trumpian loyalty, I mean compliance with the executive branch's position. You should be able to say, hey, if you're not here to represent my views, I'll replace you with somebody who is. And Trump thumps his chest in a way that very few presidents have ever thumped their chest, if any, about his own power. But he actually has no capacity to control his staff. And Susan mentioned staffers stealing announcements and letters off of his desk because they don't want him to sign them. That's an example of this defiance of the unitary executive. The more public ones are the members of the cabinet who have simply run their own foreign policies. Nikki Haley, when she was in office, just did her own thing. And she would then say, the president, our policy is this, and without regard to the fact that Trump had said not this the previous day. The most dramatic example of this is after Charlottesville, when the Secretary of State, then Rex Tillerson, is asked about the president's comments about the Charlottesville protesters, where he had said there were very fine people on both sides, and Rex Tillerson responded, the president speaks for himself. That is roughly like my left finger saying of me, Wittes speaks for himself. I speak for, the body here. And, my pinky finger does not speak for me. And the Secretary of State actually does not speak for the administration. The president does. And, and there have been, we go through in the book a long catalog of these, some of them very embarrassing for the individuals in question, where people just sort of understanding the degree of Trump's impairment kind of run their own policies and do it without reference to the president. That should be unthinkable in a president. And it is ironically paired with these very bombastic assertions of executive authority, power, unity, all of which are nonsense.
No, I agree with all of that. The extent to which, I think the way to think about it is the executive branch is a boat, and the captain's supposed to be telling us what direction to push in, to row in. And if we're all moving in different directions, it's harder to accomplish really important policy. It's hard to get anything done whenever you don't actually have a coordinating mechanism and someone credibly explaining what are the positions of the United States government so that the rest of the executive branch, so the other branches of government, can organize themselves, so that our foreign partners can organize themselves, so that our adversaries can understand credible positions to be responsive to. And so this is sort of a natural consequence of a president who doesn't have a lot of credibility and also sort of mercurial and changes his mind and speaks from the hip in a way that we actually can't, we can't sort of as a reasonable and practical matter take the statements and assertions of the President of the United States as the official policy positions of the United States government. But what that ends up creating is a chaotic situation in which actually no policy is being achieved, and there's confusion and chaos because we have various parties trying to sort of rush in and fill the void. The president is entitled to have a Secretary of Defense who shares his views. This is Jim Mattis in his resignation letter sort of made this as a pointed comment. And the president is entitled to have an Attorney General who he has confidence in. And this is sort of used as a justification for the various people that the president has pushed out or who have resigned in protest as sort of being reasons why that shouldn't be concerning to people. But it's connected to something else that Donald Trump is doing that I really think people should be taking more seriously as a significant constitutional injury. And that's whenever the president says, I like actings. And he's been really quite open about sort of the flagrant, I would call it, abuse of the Vacancies Reform Act, in which what the president does is he has acting individuals filling any number of positions at the cabinet level and down below, sort of for indefinite periods of time. And really what that does is undercut two really important and connected sort of checks. One, the screening mechanism of confirmation, of ensuring that, yes, the president has somebody that he likes and is loyal to his policy positions in a position, but also somebody that the United States Senate is comfortable with as being a sane and sort of sufficiently qualified individual to hold a particular position sort of at the front end. And so we've seen the president be able to circumvent that by appointing people for indefinite acting roles. And then on the back end, because the president has also made clear that he has no intention of actually nominating people for these positions. Whenever he first talked about wanting to fire Jeff Sessions, who was the Attorney General, for the grievous offense of Jeff Sessions having recused himself from oversight of the Russia investigation, Lindsey Graham, among others, sort of came out and said that, I wouldn't do that if I were you, because, it might be the end of your presidency, but also because you have to get a new Attorney General through the Congress. He a little bit learned the lesson when he fired Jim Comey as FBI director, that then he had to turn around and get this other guy, Chris Wray, he didn't know. He wasn't able to get Rudy Giuliani or any of the people that the president had sort of hoped to install loyalists in the position, because he had to use the advice, and he had to get through the advice and consent process. Really what we've seen is the president just sidestep that entirely. And so the United States cabinet is now really stacked with individuals, many of whom have never been nominated or confirmed. And there's no intention of nominating or confirming in the future. And that actually has really dramatically under really important check on this sort of the astonishing scope of executive power here and of presidential here. In my mind, it is surprising and a pretty dramatic failure of the separation of powers that Congress has basically just shrugged. You know, we don't see Democrats or Republicans really making this a significant issue, even really talking about it. They've just kind of accepted that this is a tolerable manner for the president to behave. And I think this is one of the areas in which there's lots happening right now. There are lots of things to be concerned about and directions in which to focus limited congressional attention and limited oversight attention. But I do think in the long term, whenever we think about sort of structural erosion that we're seeing happening right now, this sort of allowing the president to sidestep the inconvenient requirements is one that we're going to potentially having not been, sort of more careful in defense, because it is a really important principle within this larger ecosystem of a unit. The is the head and everybody else is just his arms and fingers.
Yeah, so I want to come back to several things that your comments highlighted, Susan, including the role of Congress in all of this. But before we get to talking about Congress, I want to delve further into the executive branch itself. You have a chapter in which you talk about the president and the Department of Justice, and you say that the way that he has engaged with the Department of Justice is among his gravest breaches of office. And you also talk about Trump and the intelligence agencies. And one question that I think a lot of people wonder is, how do we come back from this? So I wanted to ask, can you say a little bit about why you talk about the Department of Justice and how Trump has interacted with it as among his gravest breaches? And then also say a few words about how we rebuild institutions like the Department of Justice and the FBI and the CIA and other intelligence agencies going forward.
So this was really the issue that got us started on the book, actually. Back during the campaign, there was a series of sort of overwrought pieces by good-hearted civil libertarians who were sort of imagining what Donald Trump would do if he were elected president. And the theory of all of it was, look at all these areas that the Bush administration and the Obama administration pushed their powers. Now let's turn that amp all the way up. So we're going to have domestic drone strikes against, people who don't like the president, and we're going to have, totally amped up NSA surveillance. And I remember reading this stuff and thinking, that's not what an abusive president would do. If you're a really abusive president, the soft spot is not the intelligence community, where you have these you have relatively few political appointees. You have, at least in the case of the surveillance architecture, a highly regulated framework in the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act that reflects, what you can and can't do domestically. You have a whole set of architectures of compliance. The soft spot is the Justice Department. And what is the Justice Department? The Justice Department has hundreds of political appointees, right? 94 US attorneys alone. And then every assistant attorney general, all the deputy assistant, a lot of the deputy assistant attorney generals are political appointees. So you really get to fill the place up with your people. And it has these incredible authorities. And even before you indict somebody, just the power to investigate is really, really substantial. And the threshold for that is pretty low. You know, you got to have a reasonable suspicion based on an articulable set of facts. Well, and what holds it all together is norms and culture. And that seemed to us to be the place to start if you were an abusive president. The day after Trump won, or 2 days after Trump won, we wrote a little piece warning that the warning sign would be if you fired Jim Comey. And over time, this set of instincts over a short period of time, right? Because he comes in and the first thing he does is he tries to corrupt Preet Bharara, and when he can't do that, he gets rid of him. He gets rid of Sally Yates very quickly. That's a little bit more complicated, but it's not a good sign the way it happened. And then within a few months, he has in fact decapitated the FBI over an investigation that involves him directly. And, you know, that is something that is, we have a lot of years of that not being the way the president interacts with the Justice Department. Within a few months after that, he'd fired the Attorney General over his recusal in that case. And Trump's open position has emerged, and he's been very clear about this, that it is the job of the Justice Department to protect him and his friends and go after his enemies. And that is an extraordinary thing for a president of the United States to believe. He has, to his credit, and I think he actually deserves some credit for this, he has not been a hypocrite about this like Richard Nixon has. That is, you have John Mitchell being a criminal as Attorney General, but everybody piously says the right thing in public. Trump trumpets the wrong thing in public. He has a feudal understanding of the Justice Department. And it, you know, if we tolerate that, shame on us. We deserve what we get. How do you rebuild it? You rebuild it by having a president who does not believe those things, will stand for the right things, the right relationship, and will live it, and will appoint an attorney general of undoubted integrity and let that person rebuild internally. But don't underestimate the amount of damage that has been done. It's very substantial, and it will take a lot of rebuilding.
Yeah, I think just understanding the strange and fragile dual nature of the Justice Department and sort of being able to put a particular name and identification on norms and why they exist is some level of defense and some level of a sort of a roadmap of how we get back. So the Justice Department is sort of the most peculiar of creatures because it's both political and it has all these political appointees, and we want it to be politically responsive, right? We care whether or not DOJ is focusing on the war on drugs or when things go wrong at DOJ, we want to have somebody we could hold politically accountable. And there's a history in this country of having excessively independent law enforcement, if we think about sort of the bad old days of J. Edgar Hoover. So we've gone in a direction of very, very independent law enforcement, and we made the intentional choice to bring it back, right? We want more or some degree of political control, because political control is political accountability. But at the same time, we want independent law enforcement, because independent law enforcement is really the difference between democracies and sort of authoritarian states, right, that might have the same formal structures, but are actually wielded in this manner that Ben describes of targeting the enemies of people in power and protecting their friends. And so what we do is we have a series of, in some sense, there are articulated guidelines, but also reinforced by norms of how exactly the White House is supposed to interact with the Justice Department. What are the types of communications? And sort of these processes have developed. So, obviously the president does speak to the attorney general and they have these communications, but whenever they're talking about specific cases, either investigations or prosecutions, when there's a need to have communications that goes to the White House counsel's office, the idea that we can sort of put this legal mechanism there to help filter and make sure, that sort of only appropriate communications are happening, because this sort of notion of independent law enforcement, prosecutorial decisions that are being made solely by the interests of of justice, free from any kind of political influence or interference, is so incredibly important. But this is a fragile thing, and it only really works when all of the players care about that, care about preserving it both in fact and in perception. And so one thing we have is we have the president sort of talking about, I have the absolute right to do what I want with the Justice Department, which is a formal constitutional matter, is true. There's no DOJ in the Constitution, right? That the president is. He's the head of all of it. He can do whatever he wants. But of course, he's ignoring 100 years and really 50 years of these developed processes and procedures and mechanisms that are designed to protect this incredibly important principle. And so I think having the American public understand why it matters, what it is, and then Ben's right, the way to rebuild norms is to have the next president come in and abide by those norms, even whenever it's inconvenient. So it's one reason why, even though it might be emotionally satisfying during the Democratic primary to hear people pledge to have Donald Trump investigated or have specific members of the Trump cabinet investigated, we should be pushing back on that. We shouldn't want to hear politicians pledge specific investigations, whether it's Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, right? We should be policing that type of rhetoric. When the next president comes in, if there is a new president in 2021, that president will have to make a decision about whether or not, Chris Wray might be a perfectly nice guy, but it's not their person. And they might not think the way he got into office was legitimate as FBI director. And so they're going to face a choice. Do I want my own FBI director? And if they decide that they do want to hire a new person, this norm of a 10-year term for an FBI director will be demolished. It just won't exist anymore moving forward. They probably wouldn't be able to politically get away with that, right? Who could really object? Who among Republicans could object at this point after supporting the removal of Jim Comey? But if you care about this principle of quasi-independent law enforcement or this delicate balance, you have to be constrained even in more really deeply inconvenient. And so there's going to be, 100 of those choices that are going to be made. And the process really is about kind of rebuilding brick by brick, in these small and large decisions, but lots of decisions regarding appointments and communications and processes and procedures that the American public kind of isn't aware of, and it doesn't, hasn't in the past really appreciated why it matters.
So I'm looking at the clock and realizing this is flying by, and I have a million more questions I want to ask you, but I do want to say to those of you who are with us live in the audience that we will try to take some audience questions, so you can put them in the chat function, and Whitney Mello from the Dean's Office will have a look at those. In the meantime, I wanted to say a few words about some of the things that Ben, you and Susan were just discussing. Your story is one that is heavily informed by norms. And as a lawyer reading your book, there's not nearly as much law in it that I would have thought might have been, but it really turns out that so much of this story is a story about norms that govern. So for example, you have a chapter on the ethics issues raised by the presidency. And yes, there are some legal constructs that limit what the president can do, but there too, it's largely a story about norms and traditions and how they've broken down. In all of this, though, one thing that we've alluded to but haven't talked about in detail in our conversation is the role of Congress in all of this. So when I was reading your book, I was thinking about what do I want your next book to be? And a part of me wants you to write the book, instead of Unmaking the Presidency, Remaking the Presidency. But another part of me wonders whether there isn't a companion to this book called Unmaking Congress. How much of what we're seeing is the product of a Congress that has delegated so much authority to the executive, that has walked back from some of its oversight? You know, at the end of the book, in your epilogue, you do talk about the impeachment proceedings, and you say they're an example of where Congress is taking back some of its investigative authority. But as those proceedings have unfolded now before our eyes, and we know how they concluded, does that give you any pause in your sort of hopeful rhetoric about Congress maybe taking back some of its role in the separation of powers?
Yeah, so I think if we had to sort of fit in the epilogue, you know, we had like 8 days whenever we knew that there were going to be impeachment, or we thought there were probably going to be impeachment proceedings, but the book had to go to press. And so I think it would have ended on a less hopeful note, at least for me, had time passed a little bit more, in part because at the moment that we wrote that, my great hope was that the impeachment process and proceedings, well, I never sort of imagined they would actually result in the president being removed from office, would show sort of a reinvigorated legislative branch, a legislative branch that was prepared to take back oversight authority that it had really outsourced to the executive branch. And basically, because the executive branch is better at doing investigations, Congress has allowed sort of the executive branch in the forms of these special counsels and inspector generals as well to sort of do its job of oversight for it. And it hasn't really been particularly jealous about sort of guarding power and developing sort of robust investigatory authorities. And so I'd been hopeful maybe this would cause them to be sort of more energetic in that. I also hoped that perhaps the conclusion of the impeachment would show that impeachment is not, and removal particularly, is not just a raw count of how many members of the president's own party happen to be in the Senate at the time. And so, you know, Mitt Romney notwithstanding, I think an inspiring and very principled position that Senator Romney took. I think ultimately we did show that impeachment really is just a measurement of political power and party seats. And that has long-term consequences, because impeachment is sort of this big thing that's hanging out there that, you know, it's the big punishment that no president ever wants to come. And it's a little bit like a house of cards, that if you remove the threat of that, if your kids find out that, you know, you don't will happen if you don't do this, right? If they find out that's all a lie and there actually isn't going to be real and genuine accountability, that's bad news for the system. And so I think what we're seeing is sort of a game of constitutional hardball between the executive branch and the congressional branches, or the congressional branch right now, in which Congress has really proven itself not to be up to the task and to be sort of hopelessly dysfunctional. And that is a consequential sort of development. And I don't think that we can blame all of that on Trump. I think really it's about the pressures of this administration revealing long-standing pathology, but short of major changes in the United States Congress, it's difficult to imagine in part how the executive branch can heal itself as well. You know, we need both branches to be functional and healthy in order to keep one another accountable and healthy as well. And I think that there is really a pretty bad news story to tell. And the current crisis that we're in right now hasn't given me much hope that that we'll see sort of renewed accountability moving forward. But Ben, maybe you're more of a secret optimist than I am.
A little bit. I mean, I think if Donald Trump does not prevail in the fall, the impeachment and Congress's oppositional posture to him will be one of the reasons. And so the impeachment process may not have functioned as the mechanism to remove the president, but I don't think it was a useless mechanism. And I do think the quality of the investigation that the House Intelligence Committee performed was unlike anything Congress has done on a great many subjects in terms of speed and thoroughness in a very long time. And so I am a little more optimistic than Susan is about what this says about congressional renewal.
That's great. I'm looking at the clock, and I know we're running right up on time. We do have a couple of questions, but I know also that our guests have events back to back, and so I'm going to make myself unpopular with a couple of students who have written in with questions and ask the final question just to make sure that we stay disciplined with the clock. And I know we don't have that much time, so I want to hear from each of you very briefly how you would respond to the question of what is at stake in this next election. You've obviously written, as you said, the book in real time as things are unfolding, and you said at the outset you wanted to write it before this election. So maybe say a few words of what you see as being at stake in November.
Look, what's at stake is very simple. It's whether we're going to ratify this vision of the presidency or not. Trump has put an extraordinary thing on the table, which is a radically different vision of what the presidency should be, what it's for, how it behaves, how it sounds. And the mechanism that we have as a society for deciding whether to accept changes to the presidency is re-election or not of the people who put things on the table like that. We used to have a rule that was, again, totally normative. The two-term rule. Presidents didn't run for a third term until one did. He got reelected twice after that, and that changed the presidency. And in reaction to that, people thought long and hard about whether they wanted that change, and they decided they didn't, and it required a constitutional amendment to restore the original rule. We have in front of us an extraordinary set of propositions about what the presidency should look like. And what's at stake in the fall is, quite apart from the personality of Donald Trump, the policies of Donald Trump, whether we want to integrate those propositions into the way we understand the presidency, or whether we want to repudiate them.
Yeah, so I'll just briefly, Donald Trump has proven people like Ben and I and a lot of our assumptions about what the American public cared about wrong, right? There are a lot of people who, we talk about this traditional presidency, and there are a lot of people who, it turns out, found the way the presidents speak to be alienating and stilted. There are a lot of people who, it turns out, don't really care if the president abides by ethics rules. They don't really care if the president makes money on the side with his personal business, or whether or not he releases his tax returns. And the problem, Ben's right, re-election is ratification. And the problem is that elections tend to be very, very blunt instruments. It's all or nothing. And so this vision and this package of values for what this office is supposed to stand for, or has stood for in the past, really are on the ballot, and the question of whether or not Donald Trump is going to be able to show proof of concept. And if he does, we'll see more Trumps and newer Trumps and smarter Trumps and left-wing Trumps and right-wing Trumps, and it will fundamentally alter the office moving forward. And if instead he's repudiated, then all Donald Trump will really have proven is that you can behave the way Donald Trump does and stay in office for 4 years, but that he hasn't offered a roadmap for those who want to be two-term presidents, which most presidents want to be. And so I really do think it will be an incredibly significant moment whenever we look back on sort of the constitutional direction of the country over the long term.
Thank you so much, both of you. I want to apologize. I invited student questions, and then when I really got a handle on the clock, didn't turn to them. And I didn't because I really wanted to ask that last question. I think that is the right note to end on. There is so much at stake in November, and your book really walks through how important November is for purposes of how we think about the presidency. I want to thank you so much, Ben and Susan.
Thanks for having us.
If we, I've used this line a few times in these. If we were all together physically right now, I'd invite everybody to give you a resounding round of applause. I have no doubt that they would. They can do it actually virtually. A bunch of my students I see are giving you applause right now. And this just really was a spectacular event. It was a great capstone for the conversation series I've done. I couldn't have asked for better guests or more interesting discussion. I do want to flag again, the book is Unmaking the Presidency. And if you haven't read it, you should. And I'm particularly speaking to my students, but anyone out there who's watching, I'm sure it's up on Amazon, but even better yet, you could probably get it from your local small bookstore and support them. We have to conclude, but thank you again, Ben and Susan. This was just spectacular, and I'm so privileged and grateful to you to have been able to have this conversation. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Everybody take care of yourselves. Sorry, Susan. Everybody take care of yourselves and stay well. And thank you again for joining us. And thank you, Ben and Susan.